Hey guys, tonight we begin with a single word, a tiny, crooked, ink-stained error that somehow slipped past the quills, candles, and centuries to spark the gentlest rebellion history almost forgot. You wouldn't notice it if you flipped the parchment too fast. It's buried deep in the royal proclamation of 1772. Nestled between florid salutations and legal curtsies, a misplaced vowel, or perhaps a smudged loopnole, one can agree. But the people of Lower Plumbleton, a tiny fog-soaked hamlet hidden beneath the stooping hills of pre-industrial England, certainly noticed. To most, it was a laughable clerical oversight, something to joke about over stale ale and tepid mutton. But to the Plumbletonians, it was sacred proof that the king had inadvertently authorized something quite impossible. And from that misprint, so perfectly silly, sprouted one of the most absurd and tender-hearted civil standoffs ever recorded. But before we get to tea kettles, on battlements, and apologies delivered via goose, let's slow down. Dim your lights. Settle under the covers. Maybe bring a cup of something warm. Because tonight's journey begins not with marching drums or iron-fisted manifestos, but with a damp cellar, a candle that won't quite stay lit, and the quiet scratch-scratch of a village schoolmaster writing a very important letter. His name was Edgar Tunstall, and he smelled faintly of boiled carrots and mildew. The year was 1773, and while revolutions were brewing in Boston and Paris, Edgar was more concerned with the leaky corner of the parish archives. That's where he found it folded wrong, wedged between tax inventories and beet storage reports, a royal proclamation addressed to the loyal borough of Plumbleton. Problem was, there was no such borough. Plumbleton in North didn't exist. Never had. Edgar, who taught spelling, immediately suspected a mistake. But then he noticed something stranger. The proclamation granted this imaginary borough exemption from the new tin-glazing tax, something that had every other village up in arms, especially the ones that made their living from teacups and chamber pots. Now Plumbleton, just regular old Plumbleton, no north about it was such a place. It had 3 potteries, one of which doubled as the town pub, and dozens of proud artisans with soot-streaked aprons and fingers stained blue from cobalt glaze. Edgar, in his quiet, cabbagey way, brought the proclamation to the town elders. They stared at it for a long time. Then someone said, well, it could be us, if we all stood slightly to the left. That was the beginning, not a cry for justice, or a furious mob, just a shrug and the polite clearing of a throat. What followed was a masterclass in gentle rebellion. The townspeople began referring to themselves as Plumbleton and North. They painted the new name on their carts. They scratched it into the pub sign. They even taught the children to recite it in school, all perfectly respectful. And yet, every time a tax collector arrived, they presented the proclamation with impeccable manners and asked him to read it aloud. When he protested, they offered tea. When he refused to waive the tax, they smiled kindly and insisted the king had, in fact, already done so. Would you like a biscuit while we discuss it? They'd say, holding out a plate. Over the months, the village grew curiously fortified not with weapons, but with paperwork. Every house displayed a hand-copied version of the proclamation. The potters engraved the text on mugs. The blacksmith stamped it into horseshoes. One elderly couple even cross-stitched it into a tablecloth, which they unfolded solemnly each time the magistrate visited. The rebellion, if you could call it that, was spreading, but only in the most painfully courteous way. No one shouted, no one looted. Instead, they developed new forms of passive resistance. When royal inspectors arrived, they were greeted with precisely timed tea services and long meandering explanations of local geography. Yes, your map says there's no Norths, but you see, we interpret that as a conceptual directionality rather than a geopolitical boundary. Meanwhile, Edgar kept a meticulous log of every official visit, complaint, and conversation, all bound in calfskin and written in looping, obsessively polite cursive. And yet, behind the smiles, the village had made a quiet decision. They would not pay the tin-glazing tax. Not unless His Majesty, in writing, revoked the error and acknowledged their existence. Days became weeks, weeks turned into years. The rebellion remained small, mostly unnoticed beyond county lines. But inside Plumbleton, something extraordinary was happening. The shared delusional belief, depending on who you asked, began to transform the village. People stood taller. Children wrote poetry about being North Plumbletonians. Local songs began to reference a made-up river they claimed separated them from the southern half that didn't exist. They drew maps, invented legends. One teenage boy even started wearing a paper crown and insisting he was the Duke of the Eastern Hayloft. The town humored him. After all, he brought his own biscuits. Finally, word reached London. A low-level official in the Department of Rural Revenue read Edgar's letters and laughed so hard he dropped his inkwell. He brought the matter to his superior, who promptly lost interest halfway through the second paragraph. "If they're not burning anything, let them play their little game," he said. But then someone noticed the tax deficit. Not huge, but noticeable, and growing. A delegation was formed. 3 officials, 2 assistants, and a rather irritable clerk named Maurice descended upon Plumbleton and North on a foggy Thursday. What they found was baffling. The entire village had prepared. Bunting hung from thatched roofs. Every shop had fresh flowers in the windows. The bakery offered complimentary scones, and the townspeople, dressed in their finest, each carrying a copy of the proclamation folded neatly in their coat pockets. The delegation was ushered into the town hall, really just a barn with pretensions, and served a 7-course lunch entirely themed around the letter N. There were nettle soup, nut-stuffed pastries, and napkins embroidered with the royal seal. Edgar, wearing a bodie that had clearly seen better centuries, presented the original document, gently unfolded and placed on a velvet pillow. He smiled. "We understand it was a typo," he said softly. "But in the absence of correction, we felt it proper to act in accordance with the Crown's written word." The officials blinked. One coughed. Another stared longingly at the scones. Morris, the clerk, turned purple. "This is absurd," he declared. "Preposterous." Edgar simply nodded. Indeed, but polite. There was a silence so deep, you could hear the sheep 3 houses down. Hiccup. And then something very odd happened. The delegation did not arrest anyone. They did not find the village. They stayed the night, listened to stories, and Morris, after 3 mugs of cider, admitted he rather liked the place. When they left, they promised to raise the matter in Parliament. They didn't, but they also never came back. And so, Plumbleton continued to exist in letters, in memories, in the glimmer of blue glaze on a hand-thrown teacup. The typo was never corrected. The tax was never paid. And the rebellion continued, not with blood or banners, but with scones, cross-stitch, and the quiet defiance of those who believed that kindness, too, could be revolutionary. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine a village that politely opted out of history. A place where resistance wore wool socks and always offered you tea first. And remember, sometimes, it only takes a single wrong letter to write a better ending. Hey guys, welcome back to our strange little rebellion, where civil disobedience wore lace gloves, and everyone stood in queues for their turn to object. When last we left our heroes, the officials had visited Plumbleton and North, had some nut, loaf, got politely baffled into submission, and then vanished back to London without ever quite filing the right paperwork. You'd think that would be the end of it. A typo, a tax, a village that took things a bit too literally, curious, but harmless. Except that word began to spread. Not fast, not with fanfare, but in whispers, carried along trade routes, and over fences, and through meandering cousin letters. "Have you heard of the village that talked its way out of taxation?" they'd say. Where they made up a direction, and the Crown just nodded. Within a few years, Plumbleton and North had become something of a legend among rural towns, especially those with grievances, which, in 1770s England, was most of them. It started with small things. A village in East Gorsfield declared its river was technically a moat, thus qualifying them for castle exemptions. A hamlet near Diddlesbury claimed it had been designated a sovereign duck sanctuary by a 13th century bishop and therefore couldn't be fined for pond scum accumulation. People weren't revolting. They were cross-referencing old documents, digging through dusty records, looking for technicalities and ambiguities and royal fumbles that could grant them absurd immunities. They weren't demanding freedom. They were requesting it in triplicate. Meanwhile, back in Plumbleton North, life carried on in the same charmingly diluted way. Every spring, they held a parade in honor of the typo. Children wore sashes that read, "Proclamation Proud." The local band composed an annual march, called the Eighth Vowel, which was essentially just the national anthem played backward on accordion. The village elders by now referred to as the Council of North held bi-weekly meetings, in which they discussed hypothetical laws for their non-existent borough. These included mandatory nap hours, legal recognition of sneezes as minor blessings, and an ordinance requiring that all disputes be settled by competitive jam-making. And still, the tax collectors stayed away. A few brave souls tried to challenge the rebellion. One particularly grumpy squire from a nearby town marched into Plumbleton with a hired solicitor and a badly folded map. He lasted 3 hours. Edgar met him with tea, a 10-page argument written in rhyming couplets, and an interpretive dance demonstrating the fluidity of northernness. The solicitor burst out laughing. The squire gave up, bought a mug, and went home. But the most surreal chapter of this saga came 5 years in, when Plumbleton decided to send a diplomatic envoy to London. This was not because they wanted to negotiate, but because they believed it would be courteous to thank the king for his unintentional generosity. So they held elections, real ones, ballots inked, debates held in the bakery. The winner was an elderly widow named Miss Thistlethwaite, who had once written a poem so emotionally moving, it made 3 geese cry and 1 inspector faint. She packed a suitcase, sewed a sash that read Ambassador Ratscoon, and boarded a coach with Edgar's blessing and a tin of marmalade for the journey. She arrived in London during parliamentary recess. Undeterred, she spent 3 weeks attending public readings, sending invitations to tea to various MPs, and handing out tiny printed cards that said, "With the compliments of Plumbleton." Eventually, she got an audience not with the king, but with a junior advisor to the assistant to the undersecretary of paper goods. She curtsied so deeply she vanished behind a ficus, and then read aloud a speech thanking the monarchy for the generous accidental enfranchisement of our humble village. The advisor, unsure whether this was satire or stroke, nodded slowly and accepted the marmalade. Miss Thistlethwaite returned a hero. The village threw a feast. New songs were composed. One potter began mass-producing commemorative plates, each featuring a stylized misspelling of Plumbleton North, EST, by graceful mistake. You'd think this whimsical utopia might crumble under its own silliness, and yet, somehow, it endured, because the rebellion wasn't just about the typo anymore. It had become a way of life, a statement, a gentle thumbing of the nose at bureaucracy, not with anger, but with absurdity. They weren't fighting authority, they were lovingly confusing it. Children were taught the story in school, complete with finger puppets of historical officials. Teens competed in annual Misinterpret the Law contests, where they debated things like whether a duck in a hat could be considered nobility. Elderly citizens wore medallions stamped with the word "officially exempt" pending clarification. And still, the crown said nothing. Perhaps they didn't notice. Perhaps they were too embarrassed to correct it. Or perhaps, somewhere deep in the musty corridors of Westminster, someone was quietly rooting for them. The rebellion became self-sustaining. People moved to Plumbleton, not because of taxes, but because of the atmosphere. It was peaceful, strange, earnest, a village governed by whimsy and passive resistance. They had bylaws requiring compliments on cloudy days, shops that offered discounts if you could recite a limerick. Even the cows were somehow politer, mooing in harmonies and never chewing with their mouths open. But time, as it does, kept crawling forward. Edgar grew old. His handwriting became more like spider legs in a storm, and one winter, as frost crept across the parchment-lined walls of his cottage, he passed away with a smile on his face and a copy of the original proclamation folded neatly beside him. The village mourned with polite restraint. Bells were rung with muffled clappers. The bakery offered free crumpets for the grieving. A commemorative inkblot was added to the town's official seal in his honor. And still, the rebellion held. New leaders emerged, each stranger than the last. A man who communicated solely through semaphore. A woman who claimed her cat was the rightful heir to Plumbleton's imaginary throne. A council that debated legislation entirely in puns. And Yet the soul of the rebellion, its gentle absurdity, remained intact. The typo had become scripture. The mistake had become identity. And so, if you ever find yourself wandering through the foggy hills of England, and you stumble upon a village with oddly courteous street signs, and citizens who address each other as your grace over shepherd's pie, you may well have found Plumbleton and North. They'll invite you in, offer you tea, maybe show you the proclamation, now framed in thistlewood, and reverently dusted every Tuesday. And as you sip your drink and marvel at the sheer ridiculous beauty of it all, you might realize that rebellion doesn't always need fire or fury. Sometimes it just needs a typo, a sense of humor, and a community willing to believe in something too silly to be crushed. So close your eyes, let your mind wander down cobbled lanes that never quite appear on maps, and know this: somewhere, out there in the sleepy belly of history, there lived a village that made resistance adorable, and made the crown blink first. If you're imagining that the world's politest rebellion started with a roaring crowd storming the gates of a palace or a grand revolutionary speech delivered from the steps of a bloodied courthouse, well, you might be a few thousand decibels off. This was no Bastille Day, no Boston Tea Party, no pitchforks or guillotines or effigies hung from lampposts. No, this rebellion began on paper-thin, bureaucratic, ever so slightly crinkled paper, held in trembling hands inside a room filled with the scent of tea, ink, and second-hand velvet chairs. It was the 19th century, and somewhere in the sleepy colony of Upper Canada, in what is now Ontario, a few respectable men, with well-combed beards and pocket watches, sat in meeting rooms that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and moral superiority, and they tried very hard not to look like they were planning to append the colonial order. The trouble had started, as it often does, with land, or, more precisely, how land was being handed out to people who were very good at being friends with the governor and very bad at doing anything useful with it. The elite group of men who controlled the local government, the family compact, as they were oh so affectionately known, were experts in running a tight ship. By tight ship, we mean a political monopoly, greased with nepotism, favoritism, and tea-sipping elitism. And so, land that could have gone to hard-working settlers immigrants, who had braved forest and frostbite to build a better life, was instead being handed out to the governor's third cousins, dentist, or someone's brother-in-law, who had once read a book about agriculture, but had never seen a cow. Naturally, this did not go down well, but Canadians, being what they are, patient, courteous, and slightly allergic to confrontation, did not respond with torches or tar. No, they formed committees, polite ones, with minutes, agendas, and the occasional raised voice when someone brought up the concept of responsible government. That was the big idea floating around at the time: responsible government. It didn't mean a government that took out the bins and paid its taxes on time. It meant a system where the people actually had a say in who governed them. Radical stuff, really. The British Empire, on the other hand, preferred things the way they were: comfortable, hierarchical, and just colonial enough to keep everyone one step below a lord. But things started to change when a man named William Lyon Mackenzie entered the scene. Picture, if you will, a wiry man with a sharp tongue, a sharp pen, and a wardrobe that suggested he had never quite recovered from the fashion trauma of 1827. Mackenzie was a newspaper editor, a politician, and importantly a professional, thorn in the side of authority. He didn't call for heads to roll, but he did call out the family compact in article after article, pamphlet after pamphlet, sometimes with biting sarcasm, sometimes with painful sincerity, and always with a slightly shaky typeset that made you wonder if the printing press was being powered by sheep. And here's where the typo enters the stage. A simple printing error. Some say it was a misplaced date. Others say it was a misnamed official, ended up setting off a chain reaction of awkward letters, offended parties, and at least one rather stern tea-time conversation. The typo in question appeared in one of Mackenzie's many critiques of the local government, and, rather unfortunately, implied that a certain member of the family compact had personally ordered the relocation of poor settler families to make room for a railway project that didn't actually exist yet. Now, in a less courteous society, this would have led to public brawls, flaming torches, and loud declarations involving honor and vengeance. In Canada, it led to a formal letter of complaint followed by a retraction, followed by a letter, arguing that the retraction wasn't sincere enough, and then, in a delightful twist of passive aggression, a pamphlet titled "To Whom It May Concern," and whom it should no longer. The population, meanwhile, began to grumble in unison. Taxes were rising, land was being hoarded, and the average farmer was beginning to wonder whether empire was just a fancier word for "you don't get a say," as dissatisfaction. Brewed like oversteeped tea, the political climate began to crack not dramatically, but in little, almost imperceptible ways. Council meetings ran longer, newspapers got sharper, letters to the editor became spicier, and somewhere in the margins of all this ink and paper, rebellion began to take shape. But even here, in the early stages of unrest, civility reigned supreme. Organizers debated the ethics of civil disobedience while sipping chamomile. Proposed acts of protest were cross-checked against scripture, local bylaws, and the availability of matching waistcoats. When meetings were held, they started on time, ended with polite applause, and were followed by light refreshments and the quiet humming of nationalistic hymns that nobody really knew the words to. Still, things escalated. Mackenzie and his allies began to organize town halls and speak openly about the need for drastic reform. Pamphlets circulated that used dangerously inflammatory phrases like equal representation and tax fairness. It was the political equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded tea shop. Meanwhile, British authorities, bless them, began to notice that something was stirring in the colonies. But true to form, they underestimated it. After all, how dangerous could a rebellion be if its leaders kept writing open letters instead of picking up weapons? The answer, as it turned out, was more dangerous than you think. Because beneath the polite tones and neatly folded letters was a growing sense of betrayal. These settlers had crossed oceans, cut down forests, buried children in frozen ground, and all for the promise of freedom and opportunity. To be told politely that they weren't important enough to be heard, that their voices didn't matter, that their government belonged to a handful of smug, well-connected insiders, this was more than an insult. It was a breaking point. And so, without realizing it, the British Empire was watching the slowest, quietest powder keg in history. One built from wood smoke, paper cuts, and the stubborn refusal of Canadians to be ignored. Not with swords, not with fire, but with the most dangerous tool of Aylin, idea written down, copied, and read aloud in parlors and kitchens and post offices across the land. By the time 1837 rolled around, the colony was no longer a place of quiet compliance, though you wouldn't know it by walking down the streets. The air still smelled of burning maple and wet boots, and the people still greeted one another with respectful nods, but something had changed under the surface. It was as if the entire population had collectively decided that silence was no longer synonymous with consent. The polite letters became firmer, the petitions longer, and the speeches, once careful not to offend, now teetered on the edge of outright defiance. William Lyon Mackenzie, now more of a firebrand than a newspaper editor, had grown weary of watching reform proposals get buried under layers of bureaucracy and aristocratic indifference. He'd spent years trying to work within the system, attending legislative sessions, proposing bills, arguing eloquently, and being ignored with an efficiency that was almost impressive. By now, he had abandoned the illusion that reform could be achieved with decorum alone. He began gathering supporters, not in secret basements or candlelit taverns, but in broad daylight, under the chilly gray skies of Upper Canada, in rented meeting halls and open fields. His platform wasn't radical in theory, more representation, land reform, an end to corruption, but in a world where the elites held all the power, even common sense sounded revolutionary. And yet, in keeping with the strange tea-stained dignity of this rebellion, it was all organized with the neatness of a library index. Volunteer lists were drafted with perfect penmanship. Maps were hand-drawn on starched parchment. Protesters trained in marching techniques that prioritized not discipline or intimidation, but orderly conduct. One man reportedly brought a pocket watch to synchronize speeches. Another insisted on ironing the protest banners so they looked respectable. It was as though the entire movement feared disappointing their grandmothers more than getting arrested. And still, the rebellion gained steam. Across rural townships and sleepy hamlets, farmers and tradesmen and blacksmiths gathered to whisper about responsible government. They didn't want blood. They wanted ballots. But they were beginning to suspect they'd never get one without the other. Meanwhile, the British-appointed officials were growing increasingly nervous. They had assumed that the colonists would tire of their grievances eventually, that they would, as usual, grumble for a while, then go back to chopping firewood and paying taxes. But now, the governor's office was receiving letters from magistrates, expressing concern about the general unrest, and from clergymen who had begun to include civic virtue in their sermons. Even more unsettling were the rumors, soft, slow-moving, and persistent, about a march on Toronto. A peaceful demonstration, perhaps, or something less peaceful. Nobody knew for sure. Least of all Mackenzie, who was now being pulled in several directions at once. Some of his allies wanted to wait, keep writing, keep organizing, hope for Parliament to act. Others, especially the younger, more impatient members, wanted to take up arms. They didn't want to hurt anyone, of course. But maybe they could seize a few government buildings, hold them, make a point. Politely, maybe wave a few flags, wear matching hats. But as is often the case, when one plans a rebellion with committee meetings and typed-up schedules, things did not go according to plan. The revolution began, if you can call it that, a snowy morning in December, when a small band of Mackenzie's supporters gathered near Montgomery's Tavern, a modest establishment on Yonge Street north of Toronto. They brought with them a few rifles, a few pitchforks, and an almost laughable overabundance of overconfidence. Mackenzie had imagined a swift strike, a dramatic entrance into the city, followed by an impassioned proclamation, and, perhaps, a spontaneous show of support from the local population. Instead, the rebels found themselves standing in ankle-deep snow, shivering, arguing about directions, and discovering that revolution is significantly more complicated when your boots are wet. British troops and loyalist volunteers, better equipped, and significantly less polite, met them with swift and overwhelming force. The whole affair unraveled within days. Montgomery's Tavern was burned to the ground. The rebels scattered. Mackenzie fled. Some were arrested. A few were executed. Most simply went home, their dreams of reform reduced to soggy pamphlets and ashes in the snow. It was, by most measures, a disaster. But here's the strange thing about polite rebellions. They don't die as easily as the loud ones. The fire might have been stamped out, but the smoke lingered. In the months that followed, the British government could no longer ignore what had been made embarrassingly clear. The colonies were unhappy, and the polite silence they had mistaken for loyalty was, in fact, quiet resentment. Back in London, the events of 1837 triggered a long, uncomfortable debate about how best to manage these increasingly restless colonial children. And so, in a deeply ironic twist, it was the failure of the rebellion that finally forced the Empire to consider reform. Committees were formed. Reports were written. One of the most influential of these was the Durham Report, which took a surprisingly progressive tone, acknowledging the need for responsible government and recommending reforms that would eventually reshape how Canada and other British colonies were governed. It turns out that when polite people rebel, they don't just make a mess. They make a case. And the case made by Mackenzie and his band of frostbitten dreamers, though clumsy and ill-timed, was enough to push history forward. It would take years, of course. Nothing in Canada happens quickly, but the seeds had been planted, and they would grow quietly, stubbornly, and with extraordinary courtesy into a new political reality. Mackenzie, for his part, spent years in exile in the United States, writing about the rebellion, defending his actions, and almost certainly correcting typos. He eventually returned to Canada, even managed to get elected again, proof, perhaps, that even in politics, there's room for redemption. Or maybe just proof that in a nation built on compromise and caution, being a polite rebel is sometimes more effective than being a violent one. Whatever the case, the world's most well-mannered uprising had left its mark not in blood, not in revolution, but in reform. All because someone once misspelled a name, offended a gentleman, and opened a door that refused to be closed. In the long and yawning shadow of the failed 1837 rebellion, You might expect things to quiet down, maybe return to the orderly rhythm of snow shovels, scraping porches, of boots drying near firelit hearths, and of tea being poured while the wind groaned against the shutters. And in some ways, they did. The roads outside Toronto were once again clear of protesters, and the taverns were once again full of soft conversations and clinking glasses. But underneath the soot and silence, something had shifted, something invisible and unshakable, not in the form of another uprising, but in the very language people used, in the way they asked questions, and more importantly, in the answers they expected. It was as if the rebellion, though crushed, had scratched something permanent into the woodwork of the colony's politics, a single long question mark that refused to be sanded down. And so began the next chapter in Canada's strange political awakening, not with swords or sabers, but with a stack of papers and an English lord named Durham, who arrived looking like he was late to a dinner party he didn't want to attend. George Lambton, the first Earl of Durham, was sent across the Atlantic by a British government that had grown deeply uncomfortable with the colonial situation. London was tired of the complaints, tired of the petitions, tired of trying to figure out why the people in a frozen, sparsely populated colony, with so much forest and so few revolutions, were suddenly acting like the French, and so they sent Durham, a man known less for his diplomatic finesse and more for his confident mustache and progressive leanings. He was asked to investigate the causes of the unrest and to suggest a solution. No guns, no bayonets, just observations and recommendations. The British Empire was hoping that if they stared hard enough at the problem, it might turn into paperwork. And in a way, it did. Durham's time in Canada was brief and awkward. He didn't blend in, he didn't charm anyone, and he definitely didn't enjoy the weather. But he was observant, and more importantly, he was not stupid. He walked the streets, he spoke to officials. He read letters and newspapers. He studied the strange split between English-speaking Upper Canada and the deeply French Lower Canada, where a separate rebellion had also taken place, one even messier and more passionate than Mackenzie's ill-fated march. Durham came to the quiet, radical conclusion that none of this unrest had come from chaos. It had come from clarity. The colonists knew what they wanted, and it wasn't unreasonable. They wanted the right to govern themselves, not total independence. Not revolution, but something close to grown-up responsibilities. A system where the executive was accountable to the elected assembly, rather than to a distant governor, appointed by a British lord who had never seen a maple tree. What Durham did next would send ripples across the empire. He wrote a report. The Durham Report, as it came to be known, was long, detailed, and full of sentences that probably caused monocles to fall out in Parliament. It didn't just summarize the rebellions, it dissected the soul of colonial administration. It argued, plainly, that the old system where the local elites ruled while pretending to represent the people was no longer sustainable, and it called for a responsible government. Not as a temporary concession, but as a principle. That government should respond to the will of the people. That executive councils should be drawn from elected representatives, not appointed from golf buddies and second sons of minor aristocrats. Durham also recommended something else, that the two Canadas, Upper and Lower, should be united into a single political entity, hoping that such a union would strengthen loyalty and create a more stable government. The British reaction to the report was mixed. Some praised it as visionary. Others hissed at it like an improperly brewed cup of Earl Grey. But eventually, reluctantly, they listened, not because they had suddenly become fond of democracy, but because they had become terrified of more rebellions. And so, reforms began to trickle in, like warm sap out of a stubborn tree. In 1841, the Act of Union was passed, merging Upper and Lower Canada into the province of Canada. It was awkward and not entirely fair, especially for the French-speaking population, who were suddenly expected to play nice in a system that spoke mostly English. But it was a step, a stumbling, imperfect, deeply Canadian step toward self-governance. Over the next decade, the concept of responsible government took root. Governors began to appoint executive councils that actually reflected the will of the elected assemblies. The colonial administration grew less aristocratic and more accountable, though never fully free from the crusty fingerprints of British control. But still, for a place that had recently burned its only known rebellion headquarters to the ground, it was progress. And somewhere in the middle of this slow transformation, the memory of the 1837 rebellion began to change. It was no longer just a footnote about a failed march. It became a reference point, a strange, snowy moment when ordinary people, teachers, farmers, storekeepers, had stepped forward. Not with fury, but with firmness. Their methods may have been laughably uncoordinated. Their speeches may have been overly polite. Their weapons may have been more dangerous to themselves than to the British. But their message, buried under layers of formality, had landed. It said, "We are not furniture, we are citizens, and we have questions." In the years that followed, Mackenzie would remain a polarizing figure. Some saw him as a reckless troublemaker, others as a principled visionary. His exile ended quietly. He returned to Canada with less fire in his belly, but with a remarkable capacity for self-reflection. He would write extensively about the rebellion, trying to explain not only what happened, but why it mattered. He wanted people to understand that he wasn't trying to destroy anything. He was trying to fix something. And maybe that's the heart of why the rebellion never quite fit into the typical mold of uprisings. It wasn't born out of a desire to overthrow, but a need to participate, to be seen not as subjects, but as partners. Not as tools of the crown, but as voices in a conversation. A messy, half-frozen, overly courteous conversation. Sure, but one that shaped the way Canada would evolve in the decades to come. And so, in this quiet, often overlooked episode of history, we find the gentle birth of a louder truth, that even the most restrained voices can echo across empires, and that even when a rebellion is smothered, its questions have a way of lingering. In the snow? By the time the political dust had begun to settle, and the ashes of rebellion had cooled into the cracks of Canada's dirt roads, something peculiar started to happen, not in Parliament or war rooms or strategy meetings, but in the tiny spaces where history forgets to look. In church basements where chairs creaked under elderly legs, in general stores where sacks of flour leaned against wooden barrels, and in small-town post offices where ink-stained fingers sorted envelopes as if shuffling secrets. A different kind of rebellion was brewing, not one of weapons or speeches or dramatic declarations, but one of language, protocol, and paperwork. This was, after all, Canada, where confrontation never wore boots. It slipped politely through doors, wearing mittens. And as strange as it may sound, the next ripple of the 1837 uprising would begin not with a gunshot or a march, but with a clerical error, somewhere between the filing cabinets of colonial bureaucracy and the crisp folds of a printed proclamation. A single typo so small, it could be mistaken for a smudge planted the seed of one of the oddest developments in administrative history. To understand the impact of this typographical hiccup, you must understand how deeply the colonial administration depended on language, on declarations, charters, and legal terminology so stiff it could hold up a fence. Every law, every protocol, every communication from London to the colonies and back again traveled by ink and signature. In that world, words were not just tools, they were levers of power. They drew boundaries, determined allegiances, and, occasionally, as we're about to see, unraveled whole structures by mistake. The story goes that in the early 1840s, as the new province of Canada was adjusting to its post-rebellion identity, a new batch of official administrative documents was printed in London and shipped to the colonial offices. Among them was a routine charter, something that would have, under normal circumstances, gathered dust in a drawer and troubled no one. It was supposed to confirm the powers of a local magistrate and outline the legal terminology surrounding civil appointments. A boring document for a boring job. But somewhere in the dense forest of legal phrases, a scribe, or clerk, or typesetter, insertador, failed to remove a single word. Responsible. It was printed next to government, making it appear as though the colonial office, by charter, now officially endorsed responsible government as a legal principle. Now, if this had happened 20 years earlier, it might have been ignored. But by the 1840s, that term, responsible government, carried political weight. It was the phrase championed by radicals and reformers, by those who had watched Their friends go into exile or prison for daring to say that power should be answerable to the people. And now, here it was, printed not on a pamphlet or protest banner, but in an official colonial document with a wax seal and a signature from someone whose name sounded like a mispronounced tea brand. When news of the document reached local officials, confusion quickly turned to amusement and then to strategic silence. Technically, nothing had changed. There was no new law passed, no explicit declaration. But here, in black ink on cream parchment, was a phrase that reformers had been fighting to legitimize for years. And because the document was official, and because no one in London seemed to notice the slip, colonial leaders in Canada began to treat the term not as an accident, but as policy. They didn't march into the streets or deliver fiery speeches. They simply began to act as if the typo was intentional. Local politicians started referencing responsible government in debates, citing the document as proof of London's evolving stance. Newspapers, ever hungry for meaning in the meaningless, began publishing thoughtful analyses on the implications of this newfound recognition. It was the political equivalent of tripping over your own shoelaces and declaring it a new form of dance. The genius of this approach was its subtlety. There was no confrontation, no public defiance. Instead, colonial officials politely updated their procedures. They quietly expanded the powers of elected assemblies. They nodded at the document and used it to justify decisions that, just a few years earlier, would have earned them a swift recall to London, or worse. The British Empire, for its part, was distracted, embroiled in a half-dozen global affairs, from Indian uprisings to Caribbean trade deals. No one seemed particularly eager to argue over a technicality in a snow-covered colony where nothing exploded anymore. So, the typo remained. Unquestioned, uncorrected, unrevoked, and like a snowflake landing on a pond, it sent out ripples. Within a few years, those ripples hardened into routines, and routines into expectations, and expectations into rights. By the time someone in London finally noticed the error, it was too late. The phrase had embedded itself into the administrative language, like a polite virus in the bloodstream of colonial law. It had passed inspection, not because it was invisible, but because it was inevitable. This quiet, unintentional revolution did not come with flags or fireworks. It came with a shrug, a raised eyebrow, and the sound of a letter opener slicing open history's next chapter. It was an act of political aikido redirecting the opponent's energy using their own momentum. The typo was no longer a mistake. It was a mandate, and it changed everything. In this moment, Canada demonstrated a lesson that would confuse empires and inspire idealists for generations. Sometimes, the most effective revolutions do not announce themselves. They do not bang on doors or break windows. Sometimes they enter with a soft knock, a missing comma, or an extra word. And they remake the world not through fire or fury, but through the gentle persistence of a different way of doing things. And as the typo spread, so too did the understanding that Canada's path to self-rule would not look like America's or France's. It would be slower, stranger, and more heavily reliant on stationery. By the mid-1840s, the typo had become something of a silent mascot for Canadian politics, a ghost in the ledger books, a whisper in the council chambers, a smirk behind every bow-tied administrator's mustache. It was never mentioned aloud, and the official record, never highlighted with ink or underlined in minutes, and certainly never corrected. But everyone who mattered knew it was there. Like a polite joke told in a room full of grandparents, it lingered just long enough to shift the mood without causing offense. And so Canada, the quiet colony with the snow-heavy roofs and eternally apologetic governors, found itself navigating a new kind of governance, a self-rule, earned not by rebellion, but by paperwork, not by rifles, but by forms in triplicate. There was, of course, still London. The empire's bureaucratic eye never fully closed, but it blinked often and slowly when gazing westward across the Atlantic. In an age of transoceanic letters and delayed communications, the colonial administration in London was always at least 4 weeks behind the facts, and in that generous lagged, those precious 28 days between action and revocatim, administrators had all the time they needed to act decisively, and then couch their decisions in enough plausible paperwork to appear obedient. It was a loophole, dressed in formality, a rebellion stitched from ribbons instead of rifles. Local assemblies began interpreting the word responsible with bold creativity. It no longer merely meant sensible or orderly in the Victorian sense, it meant accountable to the people, answerable to elected representatives, beholden not to the Empire's whims, but to the increasingly confident voices of Canadian legislators. Of course, they never said it like that. They said it in memorandums, in policy shifts, in budget approvals that just happened to reflect the public's wishes. It was an era of purposeful ambiguity, where everyone pretended not to notice that. The rules were changing while quietly adjusting to the new rules. Imagine, if you will, a ballroom filled with powdered wigs and polished boots. Dancing a stately waltz and, one by one, the dancers begin to shift the rhythm ever so slightly. No one shouts, no one protests. But eventually, they are all dancing to a different tune. That was what responsible government in Canada looked like in practice. And it worked precisely because it didn't look like anything at all. But behind this administrative ballet was a man who, in his own thoroughly Canadian way, played the part of revolutionary hero without ever raising his voice. His name was Robert Baldwin, and his legacy, though as unassuming as his appearance, was as foundational as the typo itself. Baldwin was not a rabble-rouser. He wore black suits, spoke in deliberate sentences, and looked like the kind of man who would rather misplace a hat than a principle. But in the years following the rebellion, Baldwin emerged as a key advocate for responsible government, as a firebrand, but as a constitutional gardener, gently pruning the old branches and planting new legal frameworks with care. He believed in moral governance, in dignity, in reform without chaos. He also believed that revolutions were best conducted with votes, not bullets. Baldwin, alongside his political partner, Louis Hippolyte LaFontaine, a francophone lawyer from Lower Canada, formed an unlikely alliance that would come to symbolize the true soul of Canada's polite political transformation. Baldwin and LaFontaine worked in tandem, two halves of a bilingual, bicultural effort to create a government that reflected not the Empire's interests, but the people's. Their cooperation, often quiet and methodical, marked a significant departure from the Anglo-dominant top-down administration of earlier decades. Together, they drafted policies, negotiated reforms, and governed with a sincerity that bordered on saintly. They understood the power of appearances, the way a word like responsible could be made real simply by acting as though it already was. Their government didn't storm buildings or dismantle institutions. It simply began functioning as though it were answerable to the elected assembly, rather than the appointed governor. And because it functioned well, few people had the heart or the bureaucratic endurance to resist it. For the British, the situation presented a unique dilemma. On one hand, the colony was becoming more autonomous, more self-governing, and increasingly confident in its ability to legislate independently. On the other hand, there were no riots, no uprisings, no dramatic severing of ties. It was, in every visible sense, a success. The Governor-General, Lord Elgin himself, a man of considerable patience and literary leanings, ultimately endorsed the new arrangement. In 1848, he called upon Baldwin and LaFontaine to form the government, effectively acknowledging that real political power now lay with the elected representatives. This was not just symbolic, it was structural. It marked the point at which Canada became, in practice, if not in name, a self-governing entity within the Empire. And yet, despite the significance of this moment, there were no fireworks, no celebratory declarations. Just another day of snow falling gently on government roofs, and ink drying quietly on the desks of clerks. Canada had achieved what so many others had fought and bled for, not by shouting louder, but by refusing to stop whispering. The beauty of it all was how completely it fit the national temperament. A rebellion led by temperate lawyers. A revolution sparked by a typo. A constitutional shift orchestrated by men who wore waistcoats and quoted Cicero. It was as though the country had looked at the available methods of change: violence, protest, civil unrest, said, "No thank you, we'll take the one with better grammar." And so, with barely a ripple on the icy surface of the St. Lawrence River, Canada stepped into its next chapter not with a bang, but with a very well-written memo. The old order had not so much collapsed as it had politely excused itself. And while the rest of the world kept searching for revolution in the roar of the crowd, in Canada, it had come instead in the careful flick of a pen, in the turning of a page, and in the soft, unmistakable shuffle of progress arriving without fanfare. Now, if one were to walk the cobbled streets of Kingston in the spring of 1849, they might not have noticed anything unusual at all. The city smelled of thawed earth and chimney soot, as it always did when the snows began to recede. Horses clopped along muddy roads, their breath puffing white into the morning chill. And merchants opened their shutters with a kind of hopeful reluctance welcoming the change of season, even as they braced for the arrival of blackflies. But, beneath this surface of routine and resignation, something peculiar was beginning to take shape. A bill, modest in appearance but monumental in meaning, had passed through the Legislative Assembly. It was called the Rebellion Losses Bill, and its purpose on paper was straightforward: to compensate residents of Lower Canada who had suffered property damage during the rebellions of 1837 to 38. On any other day, in any other country, this might have been just another ledger entry, another shuffle of the colonial budget. But in Canada, where silence often masks strong feelings, and decorum is a deeply embedded instinct, this bill was a firecracker, tucked inside a teacup, you see. Many of those being compensated had been sympathetic to the rebellion. Some had even actively supported it, and now, the British colonial government, through the local assembly, was proposing to reimburse them, reward them, mind you, but restore what was lost. For the English-speaking loyalists, this felt like betrayal in bureaucratic clothing. To them, it was as if the government were offering tea and biscuits to the very people who had once aimed muskets at the crown. In their view, rebellion was not something one papered over with polite checks and compensation forms, which treason, even politely committed, should not be reimbursed. So began what would come to be known as the Montreal Riots of 1849. And yes, you heard that correctly, riots, in Canada, involving more than just strongly worded letters or collective sighs of disappointment. For once, the tension that had been simmering under the surface between English and French, Loyalist and Reformist, past and future, boiled over into something altogether messier. When Governor-General Lord Elgin, a man known more for his diplomatic restraint than his daring, gave royal assent to the bill, the backlash was swift. That very night, as his carriage passed through the streets of Montreal, it was pelted with stones and rotten vegetables. He did not respond with armed guards or angry proclamations. He simply endured it, as if absorbing the stones himself might somehow preserve the fragile peace of the realm. But the crowd was not finished. They turned their fury toward the Parliament building itself, a beautiful neoclassical structure situated at the foot of Placed Arms. Within hours, the building was set ablaze. Flames clawed through its wooden beams and roared into the night, sky swallowing decades of public records, books, and legislative journals. The fire lit the Montreal skyline with a glow that was equal parts fury and symbolism. It was the first and only time in Canadian history that a parliament was burned down by its own citizens. And it happened not because the government had overreached with violence or cracked down with oppression, but because it had been too generous, too conciliatory, too ready to forgive. One might think such an event would unravel the whole delicate political experiment. And indeed, there were calls from angry mobs to revoke responsible government, to restore tighter imperial control, to root out what they saw as French treachery. But the response from the Canadian government was silence. Calm, patient, measured silence. Lord Elgin refused to use troops to quell the riots. He did not resign, though many begged him to. Instead, he released a brief statement affirming the Assembly's right to pass laws, even unpopular ones, and urging citizens to respect the rule of law. And that was it. No grandstanding, no martial law. Just a quiet insistence that the democratic process mattered more than any building or mob. Remarkably, it worked. The riots sputtered out. The Parliament relocated temporarily to Toronto, then to Quebec City, before settling years later in Ottawa. And with each relocation, the idea of responsible government solidified further, not because it was easy, but because it had survived its first true test. There was something uniquely Canadian about it all, a political philosophy that could survive arson, not by force of arms, but by sheer collective will to stay calm and carry on. The Rebellion Losses Bill was never repealed. The checks were mailed. The damaged houses were repaired. The rebels-turned citizens went back to planting crops and attending church and writing passive-aggressive letters to the editor. And in that quietly radical act of forgiveness, Canada demonstrated something rather profound, that reconciliation, however slow and awkward, was stronger than vengeance. It's worth pausing here to consider just how rare this path was in the mid-19th century. Elsewhere in the world, empires were crumbling under the weight of revolution. In Europe, 1848 had been a year of fire and barricades. Monarchies toppled. Cities burned. Blood ran in the streets of Paris and Vienna. But in Canada, the revolution was smothered with paperwork, redirected through legislative channels, and cooled by a snowfall of good intentions. No guillotines, just committee meetings and town hall votes. Some historians have argued that the fire in Montreal marked a turning point, might because it destroyed a building, but because it tested the limits of the Canadian temperament. And the country passed, not by punishing the arsonists harshly, but by refusing to stoop to their level. In a way, it was the ultimate Canadian response. Don't escalate. Don't retreat. Just politely proceed through the chaos until calm returns. From that moment on, responsible government was no longer a theory or an experiment. It was the bedrock of Canadian politics. And it had been earned, not through war or bloodshed, but through endurance, moderation, and, yes, a little bit of smoke damage. So as the Parliament smoldered and the ashes settled over the cobblestones of Montreal, a peculiar peace fell over the colony. The kind of peace that can only come after surviving an argument with your loudest neighbor without slamming the door. And in that peace, a quiet new identity took root. One built, not on conquest or defiance, but on civility, compromise, and the unshakable belief that if everyone just calms down and waits their turn, things will probably work out in the end. By the time Canada's legislative ashes were swept away and a temporary home for its wandering parliament had been secured, something quietly transformative had taken root in the minds of its citizens, an odd but sturdy sense that political life, like Canadian weather, could be endured with layers of patience and the occasional umbrella of politeness. It was a nation not born in fire and revolution, but rather tempered by them, like iron slowly forged, not by heat alone, but by the cool water afterward. Yet the question lingered, what now? The rebellion had come and gone, twice. The capital had been torched, compensated, and shuffled east and west like a wandering theater troupe. The French and English had hissed at each other across chamber floors and barroom tables. And yet here they all still were neighbors, taxpayers, and reluctant countrymen. And as often happens, when tempers cool and smoke clears, attention turned to the most peculiar matter of all. Spelling, because, buried beneath the drama and the diplomacy, hidden in the fine print of compromise, there was a quiet but persistent problem no one had yet managed to solve. Canada, it seemed, could not decide how to spell itself. Was it labor or labor? Center or center? Program or program? Even the country's name itself had once been misheard, famously, by French explorers mistaking the Iroquoian word Kanata, meaning village, or settlement, for the name of the entire land. And so Canada, it remained, a place named by accident, legislated by compromise, and defined by confusion over which dictionary to consult. These were not just idle debates. The spelling of government documents, school books, and railway signage became a small but symbolic battlefield in the wider tug-of-war between British tradition and American influence. Loyalists from Ontario would bristle at any dropped U, seeing it as the creeping threat of republicanism in linguistic clothing. Meanwhile, the more pragmatic reformers, many of whom looked southward with wary curiosity, argued that standardization, even if American in flavor, would make trade and correspondence easier. You might think it trivial, but in a country where revolutions were rare and policies passed slowly through foggy deliberation, spelling became one of the most hotly contested battlegrounds of identity. For example, when Canadian newspapers began printing editorials in favor of color without a U, angry letters flooded the editors' desks. One particularly upset reader from Halifax declared that the dropping of the U was akin to leaving a queen out in the cold. Another from Montreal simply refused to subscribe until the editors promised to respect the integrity of the English tongue. Of course, the editors did no such thing, and so quietly, Canada entered an age of double spellings. Schoolchildren were taught to accept both realize and realize as correct, though teachers still had private preferences. Street signs in Ontario began to list Centre Street, even as private businesses opened centre taverns. The railways labeled stations with one spelling on the ticket and another on the timetable. It was confusing, yes, but not chaotic. In fact, it was perfectly Canadian, a country that could not quite choose a side, and so decided, gracefully, to include both dictionaries, to split the difference. The first truly Canadian dictionary attempted to bridge the divide by simply listing both British and American spellings side by side, with no preference stated. It was, in a way, the literary version of bilingualism before bilingualism became official policy. And here we find the strange poetry of Canadian nation-building. A rebellion may set your parliament on fire, but a misplaced vow can divide your school boards for decades. It wasn't just about spelling, of course. The deeper tension was about identity. Were Canadians British subjects, North American cousins, a hybrid of colonial roots and continental realities? These questions were too large, too abstract, and too politically perilous to answer outright. So instead, they were funneled into the manageable realm of orthography. When debates about monarchy and federalism grew too heated, politicians would pivot to complaints about the way a government sign had spelled defense. In that way, language became both a shield and a substitute, a way to argue about Canada without ever saying the word nation. And the people, for the most part, accepted this compromise. Because while the rest of the world bled over borders and banners, Canadians had found a quieter battleground, one where no one died, but plenty disagreed. It was not flashy, but it was effective. The country's soul was shaped not in smoke-filled revolutions, but in libraries, classrooms, and government typing pools. Typists became unintentional philosophers. Civil servants debated commas with the solemnity of judges, and schoolchildren were taught to write essays using neighborhood with a U, but told not to mark neighborhood wrong if it appeared in a library book from across the border. This tolerance extended even to official documents. During one especially memorable parliamentary debate in 1852, a bill was brought forth to standardize the spelling of harbor on all government maps. It failed by a single vote. The reason? One legislator from New Brunswick insisted that harbor was how his grandfather spelled it, and therefore it was good enough for him. And that was that. The mapmakers were told to keep both spellings, depending on the province. It is difficult to overstate just how uniquely Canadian this was, a country that found national cohesion, not through uniformity, but through accommodation. Where others sought a singular identity, Canada embraced dualities, not out of indecision, but out of a deep-seated belief that being many things at once was not a weakness, but a strength. And so the typists kept typing, the schoolbooks kept printing, and the railways kept announcing departures from both Centre Station and Centre Junction. It was a rebellion of vowels, a revolution in punctuation, a political movement, expressed not in marches but in style guides. And as time passed, the debate faded not because it was resolved, but because everyone grew used to the difference. Canadians learned to live in the overlap, to accept the tension, and even to find comfort in it. It is said that if you open a Canadian government document today, you might still find both spellings coexisting peacefully, side by side, as if they were old neighbors who had long ago decided to stop arguing over the fence and just share the garden. In the end, perhaps that is the most Canadian outcome of all, not a decisive victory, but a polite arrangement. And so, as the decades crept onward, Canada, this strange, stitched together patchwork of tongues, loyalties, and carefully hedged policies, began to settle into its oddly dignified confusion. The rebellions were distant now, their smoke and urgency long since replaced by parliamentary routine and regional compromise. But the memory of those early fires lingered in the quiet spaces between debates. In the footnotes of history books, and in the pauses between yes and no on the parliamentary floor. For those with long enough memories or patient enough temperaments, it became increasingly obvious that the story of Canada's nationhood wasn't really one of grand moments at all, but rather of drawn-out silences, mild disagreements, and bureaucratic persistence. The country had become like a vast and stubbornly calm river, never quite still, but never entirely rushing forward either. Somewhere between the old world and the new, it chose instead to glide sideways, cautiously, politely. Take for instance the great railways that eventually stitched together East and West. These were not merely feats of engineering, they were nation-building by other means. Carefully laid track by carefully laid track, in the hope that physical connection might somehow smooth over the cultural disconnects that persisted. And yet even here, the typographical rebellion found new soil. Station names across the country were often misspelled, sometimes by accident, sometimes by local whim. One small town in Manitoba insisted on spelling its name with an extra E, despite all federal maps omitting it. When the railway company finally updated the sign, they spelled it both ways, one on each side of the platform. Locals nodded in quiet approval. They liked that sort of thing. No need to argue when you can simply acknowledge both versions and get on with it. This habit of accepting contradiction without resolution became something of a national skill. Other countries might have revolved around ideology or manifest destiny, but Canada revolved around shared tolerances and linguistic footnotes. It was a country where public debates about national destiny might be politely postponed in favor of a discussion on how to pronounce schedule. And while critics occasionally mocked the country for its lack of assertiveness, its fondness for middle ground solutions, and its chronic politeness, Canadians seemed largely unbothered. After all, isn't it better to be mildly misunderstood than violently certain? As the years passed, new generations grew up with a peculiar confidence in this ambiguity. Children learned that identity could be plural, that languages could coexist without merging, and that history, while important, was rarely tidy. The past was not a single tale, but a series of side stories, half-remembered rebellions, and the lingering scent of ink on compromise-laden treaties. And amid all this, the typo remained. That small administrative blunder from decades ago, one that had shifted a policy, sparked an unintended bill, and ultimately helped set off a minor rebellion, was never quite corrected. It didn't need to be. Its consequences had already unfolded, had already been soothed by the slow balm of Canadian diplomacy, and had already merged into the broader pattern of the country's carefully accidental history. By the time the centennial approached in 1967, there were entire committees assigned not just to celebrations and monuments, but to the wording of commemorative plaques. Arguments broke out not over who deserved recognition, but over whether the plaques should favor British spelling, or the emerging hybrid that now characterized much of Canadian writing. In typical fashion, the solution was to let each region decide for itself. The result was a mosaic of bronze inscriptions, some honoring pioneers, others honoring them, depending on where one stood. Tourists found it charming, locals found it normal, and historians, predictably, wrote long essays about it. The great irony, of course, was that the typo itself, the spark that had ignited all this slow burning, administrative evolution, was never reprinted in textbooks. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was difficult to explain. There was no battlefield to point to, no heroic martyr to idolize, no statue-worthy figure to embody the mistake. It was simply a clerical error, a small misalignment between intent and execution, followed by a nation's long, winding journey to make peace with its consequences. In this way, the story vanished not from memory, but from spotlight. It became part of the Canadian subtext, the kind of thing one professor might mention offhand in a university seminar, prompting a room full of slightly confused but vaguely amused students. Some would shrug, a few would take notes, and one or two, if they were paying very close attention, might recognize that this in its own subtle way was how Canada had always worked. Not through decisive breaks, but through gradual adjustments. The typo, in all its accidental glory, had helped force the country to define itself not by what it was, but by how it responded to what it never intended to be. And perhaps that's why the rebellion, it accidentally fueled came to be remembered, not with bitterness or outrage, but with a kind of sheepish nostalgia. It had not overthrown a regime or redrawn a continent. It had merely nudged a polite, unsure country a little closer to understanding itself. And in a world so often obsessed with power and revolution, there was something deeply comforting about that. Canada had rebelled not with muskets or barricades, but with parliamentary votes, regional grumbling, and gently misaligned typefaces. Its revolutionaries had been farmers and editors, schoolteachers and rail clerks, not radicals. Their slogans had been debated, not shouted. Their victories came not with parades, but with policy tweaks. And while other nations celebrated their bloody origins with firecrackers and flags, Canada quietly updated its signage, adjusted its spelling guides, and moved on. It was, in every way, the world's most polite rebellion sparked by a typo, carried forward by conversation, and concluded with a mutual agreement to disagree. There are worse ways to make a country. As the echoes of the rebellion grew softer with time, the peculiar way it had begun remained a kind of national riddle, something between a joke and a fable, retold occasionally over coffee in quiet libraries, or halfway through dry academic lectures when the audience needed a small moment of levity. The typo itself, now long buried beneath layers of bureaucratic history and gently yellowing archives, refused to vanish completely. It was a ghost in the margins, a misplaced word that had, with all the dramatic impact of a dropped comma, nudged a sprawling and hesitant country toward a different sort of future. But of course, this wasn't the only moment when such a quiet ripple had grown into a wave. Canada, in its peculiar fashion, had always been a land defined not by grand declarations, but by minor miscommunications, often between its many governments, sometimes between its people, and almost always between its official paperwork and the lived reality of its citizens. Consider, for instance, the curious case of the dual-language road signs. By the mid-20th century, efforts to enforce bilingual signage were well underway, driven by the ever-present need to maintain linguistic balance between French and English speakers. On the surface, this seemed simple enough. Just print everything, twice. But things rarely went to plan. Translation errors crept in, sometimes hilariously. A stop sign in rural Ontario once featured the English word stop, and, instead of the correct French translation, arrête, the word arrête, which doesn't mean stop, but rather arrested. The sign remained for years, becoming something of a local joke. Travelers would pull over, uncertain whether to halt their cars or prepare for handcuffs. In another village, a tourism brochure translated "Welcome to our friendly town" into French as "Bienvenue, à notre ville amicale," which, to native speakers, read more like "Welcome to our romantically friendly town." No one took offense. Instead, the brochures became collector's items, symbols of the country's unintentional charm and its enduring, if occasionally clumsy, commitment to dual identity. And then there were the maps. Canada's cartographic history is a rich tapestry of assumptions, guesswork, and occasionally outright fantasy. Explorers in earlier centuries had charted coastlines with admirable confidence, despite not having reached them. One famous map from the 1700s included a river that did not exist, simply because a fur trader had mentioned it in a tavern. The mapmaker, working from Europe and on a tight deadline, included it anyway. The river made it into several atlases, was referred to in legal disputes, and even inspired a small town to name itself after the phantom waterway. Only generations later did someone quietly update the maps, deleting the river with no explanation. No one complained. If anything, the locals were slightly disappointed. They liked having a river on paper, even if it never touched their land. This kind of administrative mythology mistakes, quietly folded into the national record, became something of a hallmark. A bird species misidentified in a provincial report was adopted as a regional emblem. A clerical error in a census lead, to a sudden statistical explosion of left-handed schoolteachers in Saskatchewan, the government issued a correction a year later. But the local papers had already run celebratory editorials about the province's educational diversity. Even weather reports weren't immune. For nearly a decade, a malfunctioning station in the north consistently reported abnormally warm winters, Climate scientists scratched their heads. Tourists began booking vacations. When the error was finally traced to a thermometer, placed too close to a heating vent, the news was met, not with outrage, but with mild amusement. After all, everyone enjoyed the idea of a warm Arctic outpost, even if it was imaginary. But behind the laughter and the light-hearted anecdotes, a deeper pattern emerged. Canada, more than many nations, had learned to live comfortably with the idea of human error. Rather than correcting every misstep with embarrassment or anger, the country quietly absorbed its mistakes, adapted to them, and let them settle into the fabric of its reality. It was not perfection, but a kind of practiced, pragmatic humility. The rebellion born of a typo fit right into this rhythm. It hadn't tried to overturn the system. Instead, it had poked the system gently, reminded it of its fallibility, and nudged it toward a slightly more inclusive, slightly more self-aware shape. That this change had come from a misprinted document rather than a revolutionary manifesto only made it more Canadian. It was a lesson in lowercase letters rather than capital crusades, and perhaps that's why, even today, the legacy of that error lingers not in museums or monuments, but in the quiet way Canadians approach disagreement with: a deep breath, a long sentence, and a preference for process over protest. It's there in the committee meetings that stretch for hours longer than anyone expected, in the national debates that prioritize civility over speed, and in the persistent habit of rechecking official forms before submitting them. No one wants to be the next typo. And yet, secretly, everyone knows that the typo is part of what makes the country work. For what is a nation, really, if not a long conversation interrupted occasionally by accidents? Canada embraced its accidents. It took missteps and misunderstandings and turned them into policy revisions, regional accommodations, and occasional legendary rebellions. The country never quite shouted itself into existence. It mumbled, corrected itself, and then politely insisted that yes, this was exactly what it meant all along. And in doing so, it offered the world a different kind of origin story, one in which mistakes weren't signs of weakness, but opportunities for gentler, quieter growth. Somewhere, far from Ottawa's hushed hallways, and even farther from the towns and kitchens where the polite rebellion stories lingered. Another consequence of that now famous typo was unfolding not in the corridors of power or on the parchment of legislation, but in the quiet realm of national identity. For all its meticulous census-taking, its careful border surveying, and its obsession with correct spelling in both English and French, Canada had always been a country unsure of what exactly it was supposed to be. This wasn't from a lack of ideas, there were plenty. Some believed Canada to be a haven of multicultural harmony, others as a rugged northern wilderness tempered by gentle manners, and still others saw it as Britain's well-behaved younger cousin, standing politely at the edge of every international meeting, waiting for someone to notice its excellent penmanship. But the typo, ridiculous as it may have seemed, had done something profound. It had shown Canadians that their country wasn't just the sum of its official definitions, but also the result of its unofficial accidents. And there was something oddly comforting about that, about knowing that even a bureaucratic blunder could push history forward, if only by a polite inch or two. In the years following the rebellion, that accidental energy began to surface in subtle but persistent ways. Students studying political science began referencing the typo as a case study in unintended consequences, often with a half smile, half sigh, knowing full well that no professor could mark them wrong. It had, after all, happened. Linguists, meanwhile, began exploring the philosophy of government language with renewed interest, wondering whether precision was truly possible in a nation built on 2 official tongues and at least 50 unofficial ones. And in a particularly poetic twist, Canada's top universities began offering seminars titled The Power of Mistakes, where the polite rebellion was featured alongside other historical errors that had, through sheer serendipity, turned into milestones. Enrollment was always full, but perhaps the most touching ripple of all came not from scholars or students, but from the civil servants themselves, the clerks and typists and middle managers whose days were spent scanning forms, proofreading announcements, and gently correcting the tiny errors that democracy seemed to produce at a steady, unstoppable rate. For decades, they had operated like invisible machinery, always in the background, always cautious, never seeking glory. But now, in light of the rebellion's odd origin, their work had taken on a strange new dignity. They weren't just paper pushers anymore, they were guardians of national stability. Accidental architects of policy shifts, silent midwives of history. They joked about it in break rooms. They passed around mugs that read typo, today, revolution, tomorrow. And though few would admit it, there was a quiet pride in knowing that something as small as a misprinted clause could hold within it the potential to awaken a conversation that had been sleeping for decades. The government, too, leaned into the narrative, without ever outright admitting fault because, after all, it remained unclear whether the original typo had been a printing error, a transcription slip, or just a very oddly worded directive issue. Began to speak more openly about transparency, flexibility, and the evolving nature of Canadian governance. It became fashionable, in certain circles, to refer to national policy as a living document, one that responded not only to the people's needs, but occasionally to its own formatting flaws. What might have been scandalous elsewhere was, in Canada, reframed as endearing a sign that, even in its missteps, the nation could be trusted to self-correct, gently, respectfully, and without too much fuss. Outside Canada's borders, the story took on a life of its own. Late-night comedians in the United States made light of it, of course joking that only in Canada could a rebellion begin with a misplaced adjective and end with more equitable funding for local libraries. But international academics, particularly those who specialized in conflict resolution, began to study the episode more seriously. Think tanks from Europe to Southeast Asia invited Canadian officials to speak on the effectiveness of non-policy correction, which sounded impressively technical, but usually boiled down to, don't panic, be kind, and double-check your paperwork. Somewhere in Geneva, someone even proposed the Canadian typo doctrine, a theoretical framework suggesting that all political systems should include room for harmless errors that, once discovered, could serve as catalysts for inclusive dialogue. It never quite caught on as official policy, but the phrase did make its way into a few academic journals and more than one coffee mug. Back home, in the quieter corners of the country, the kind with one main road and more moose than mayors, tale took on an almost mythic quality. Children heard about it from their grandparents, who would lower their voices at just the right moment to whisper, and that's how we almost started a civil war, but decided not to. The story joined the ranks of other great Canadian near events. The time the country almost adopted a different flag. The time Newfoundland nearly voted itself independent again. And the time a prairie town accidentally elected a dog as mayor, for 3 days before someone noticed. These weren't failures, they were folklore, and they mattered, because they gave people a sense that their country wasn't run from a distant marble tower, but from within the fog of daily life where things are often messy, funny, and slightly off-center. The typo itself was never officially preserved. There was no museum exhibit, no engraved plaque. Some said the original document was quietly corrected and filed away. Others claimed it had been destroyed to avoid embarrassment. But in truth, none of that mattered. The mistake had already done its work. It had proved that national direction could shift not only through great speeches or violent confrontation, but through a humble, hilarious accident. It had reminded everyone from ministers to mail carriers that democracy, at its heart, was a deeply human endeavor, subject to the same quirks and charms as the people it served. And in a world that often demanded perfection from its governments and outrage from its citizens, Canada had, for once, offered something else, the possibility of change through kindness, policy through patience, and the gentle revolution of a typo. There's something oddly comforting about knowing that a revolution can begin, not with muskets or manifestos, but with a clerical oversight buried in a 1,000-page document no one was supposed to read. The people of Canada, known far and wide for their love of order, decency, and two-language packaging, had never asked for grandeur. They did not storm castles or decapitate monarchs. Instead, they stood in line, raised polite objections, and drafted very well-structured emails. And yet, the typo, that quiet little ghost in the machine, had offered them something far more transformative than a riot ever could. It had given them a story, not a story of rage or vengeance, but of mild confusion, followed by thoughtful dialogue. It was a tale in which ordinary citizens became reluctant philosophers, where postal workers quoted legislation, and where librarians hosted town halls beside their checkout desks. All across the country, in places with names like Moosejaw and Tricadie, people gathered not to protest with placards, but to discuss, share soup, and respectfully raise questions about tax codes. What emerged was not a rebellion in the classic sense, but a gentle reimagining of participation. The kind where people who had never considered themselves political began sending letters to ministers. Not to demand heads, but to suggest commas. "Have you considered rewriting clause for C for clarity?" became a popular phrase, printed on tote bags and whispered with delight. In one particularly memorable instance, a group of retirees in Saskatchewan organized a book club focused entirely on reviewing government documents for style and tone. Their conclusion: too many semicolons, not enough empathy. The government, caught off guard by this wave of courteous scrutiny, scrambled to adjust. Not because it was under siege, but because it found itself slowly, inexorably, being held to account by a populace armed with grammar, guides, and moral conviction. Civil servants began to experience a kind of existential panic, not the kind that results in career change or deep personal turmoil, but the kind where one wakes up at 3 a.m., wondering if whereas should have been provided that. A new awareness took root in Parliament. Politicians, once content to rely on jargon and platitudes, were now expected to explain themselves with precision and terrifyingly warmth. Gone were the days of impersonal press releases and cold procedural language. Now, ministers had to appear in town halls, holding mugs emblazoned with "Mind the Clause," answering detailed questions from 11-year-olds about how many typos it took to trigger a constitutional review. And though they grumbled privately, they complied. Because to ignore these newly engaged citizens was to risk becoming the next accidental footnote in an increasingly typo-sensitive history. Yet for all its whimsy, there was something deeply serious undergirding the rebellion. The typo had tapped into a well of quiet dissatisfaction, an ambient hum of discontent that had until then been drowned out by politeness and snowplows. It wasn't just about funding models or bureaucratic mishaps. It was about recognition. About people in far-flung corners of a vast country wanting to feel seen, heard, and included in the project of governance. The rebellion had reminded everyone from Timmins to Tofino that even the most functional democracy needs to be reminded that it is still, first and foremost, a conversation. And if that reminder comes wearing a wool hat and offering you a thermos of tea, so be it. In classrooms, the rebellion became an unlikely lesson plan. Teachers explained it not through diagrams of battlefields or treaties signed under duress, but through email chains, edited memos, and community newsletters. Students laughed, of course, at the absurdity of it all, but they also learned that governance isn't just about power, it's about participation, even if that participation involves proofing PDFs. History, they discovered, doesn't always happen with banners and blood. Sometimes it unfolds in margin notes in coffee shops. And so, generations of young Canadians came to see their country not as something handed down, but something constantly under construction, subject to revision, debate, and, yes, the occasional typo. Meanwhile, archivists, custodians of public memory, found themselves caught in a strange dilemma. On the one hand, the original document containing the typo was of undeniable historical significance. On the other, no one could quite agree which version it was. Some said it had been corrected before public release. Others argued that early drafts had circulated unofficially. A few conspiracy-minded scholars even claimed the typo was a deliberate act, planted by a rogue public servant intent on triggering systemic reform via linguistic mischief. Though the evidence for this was, at best, imaginative, it added a layer of intrigue that scholars couldn't resist. Debates raged quietly in academic journals, and very quietly in conference panels. The phrase typogate was whispered with the kind of reverence usually reserved for lost manuscripts and secret amendments. Eventually, the National Archives issued a statement clarifying that while they could not definitively confirm the identity of the typo in question, they were committed to preserving the spirit of the event through careful documentation of public response. This vague but oddly moving declaration was received warmly and promptly printed on bookmarks. Elsewhere, the corporate world couldn't help but join in. A major coffee chain launched a seasonal typo blend, a medium roast described as unintentionally bold, with notes of citrus and reform. A national airline offered discounted flights under the banner "Fly Politely," because revolution should be And somewhere in Alberta, an enterprising entrepreneur began selling novelty stationery, stamped with certified typo proof. Though whether it actually was remained a matter of some debate. For a country long accused of being boring, predictable, or too nice, the rebellion became a badge of honor, not because it was wild or thrilling, but because it proved that a nation could face its flaws without losing its balance. In a world increasingly addicted to drama, the idea that change could emerge from kindness and clarity felt almost radical. And so, in the final reckoning, the typo endured, not just as a mistake, but as a moment. A moment when an entire nation paused, squinted at the fine print, and chose not to erupt, but to engage. Chose not to destroy, but to discuss. A moment when rebellion meant asking better questions, revising old answers, and leaving behind not wreckage, but revised documents, warmer policies, and a story to pass along softly, sleepily, one sentence at a time. As the rebellion, if it could even still be called that, tripled gently across Canada, it began to take on a strangely theatrical air, as though the entire country had been unwittingly cast in a stage production, written by a particularly polite playwright with a fondness for municipal regulations and laminated feedback forms. In town after town, from Vancouver Island's foggy harbors to the icy edges of Labrador, people were rehearsing a new civic script, not dramatic, not revolutionary, but oddly heartwarming. School gymnasiums became ad hoc, debating halls. Public libraries started hosting legislation, literacy nights, and small-town mayors suddenly found themselves the most sought-after guests at potluck suppers. Instead of chants or slogans, participants brought bullet points and thermoses. Entire communities began reviewing zoning laws together, often in silence, occasionally with a quiet hum of disapproval when they spotted another ambiguous clause. There was no central leadership, no manifestos or secret handshakes. The rebellion spread not like wildfire, but like the steady unfolding of a crochet blanket, connected, deliberate, comforting in its pace. A particularly inspired village in New Brunswick formed a typo tribunal, an informal panel of grammar teachers, retired clerks, and one particularly meticulous beekeeper, whose sole purpose was to review official documents for clarity, inclusivity, and tone. Their verdicts, though non-binding, were taken seriously by local officials, and some were even adopted verbatim into municipal bylaws. No one could quite explain why this mattered so much, but it did. The typo had peeled back the layers of public fatigue to reveal something rare and luminous: a widespread desire to be spoken to like adults, to be included in decisions not as numbers or demographics, but as people with thoughts, questions, and a decent understanding of the Oxford comma. Media outlets, initially baffled by the movement's lack of outrage, began covering it with a tone of bemused admiration. Headlines like "Canada's Quiet Quibble becomes national conversation and revolution by revision. How the North fixed a nation one footnote at a time" began to appear. Late-night comedians tried to satirize the rebellion, only to find that the jokes made people feel warm and nostalgic instead of cynical. One popular sketch featured an elderly librarian storming a federal building with nothing but a red pen and a pocket edition of the Canadian Constitution, demanding, "Just let me make a few changes to the preamble." It became an instant meme, and within days, red pens sold out across bookstores in Ontario. In the digital sphere, things were equally curious. Social media platforms, long saturated with fury and sarcasm, began to witness a strange shift. Instead of trolling or outrage, users began participating in what became known as civil edits, rewriting badly worded laws, policies, or political speeches with suggested improvements, always framed in gentle, constructive language. A post that began with "Excuse me, but might I humbly suggest a rephrasing of Clause 3, would garner thousands of likes. Hashtags like #typo-rebellion and #grammar for justice trended globally for nearly a week. Confusing outsiders, and drawing admiration from countries unaccustomed to mass movements, driven by a collective desire for clearer wording. Foreign journalists, unsure of what to make of it all, descended on Canada hoping to find some chaos they could film, some protest they could broadcast. Instead, they found community centers filled with neighbors sipping tea over policy papers, and public forums where disagreements were resolved with thoughtful pauses and group consensus. One baffled correspondent from a major European news outlet reported that the only confrontation he witnessed during a week-long visit was a heated but deeply respectful debate about whether moreover was too archaic for contemporary legislation. That clip, though entirely devoid of shouting, went viral anyway. It captured something deeply appealing: the possibility of disagreement without animosity, of discourse without destruction. Not everyone was charmed, of course. A few commentators insisted that the rebellion was nothing more than a distraction, a national bout of performative politeness. They argued that real change required confrontation, not coffee clutches. But even they were forced to admit, albeit begrudgingly, that policies were being updated, civic engagement had soared, and public trust in institutions had risen up because of any sweeping decree, but because people had finally been invited to read the fine print and speak up when it didn't make sense. It turned out, perhaps to everyone's surprise, that most citizens didn't want to tear the system down, they just wanted it to stop using run-on sentences and legal jargon so thick you'd need a chainsaw to get through it. In Ottawa, the federal government found itself scrambling to keep up. Cabinet ministers began holding weekly sessions with plain language consultants. Parliamentary procedure was overhauled to allow public comment on all new legislation drafts, with a dedicated portal for style and grammar suggestions. The change was subtle, but undeniable. Speeches grew warmer. Laws became less labyrinthine. And for the first time in living memory, political language in Canada began to sound not just intelligible, but human. Universities began offering courses in civic clarity, combining public policy with narrative structure and sentence economy. Enrollment was high, especially among older adults who had lived through decades of bureaucratic fog, and were eager to leave something better for their grandchildren. One elderly student summed it up beautifully: "I don't want to die knowing my grandkids still have to read tax forms like they're decoding ancient scrolls." Perhaps the most unexpected consequence of the typo rebellion was spiritual. Religious leaders from across denominations began incorporating themes of clarity, truth, and linguistic compassion into their sermons. A popular Unitarian minister in Halifax delivered a sermon titled, "In the Beginning Was the Word," and "The Word Needed Editing," which drew record attendance and was later adapted into a successful podcast. Even more remarkably, gatherings were held not to debate theology, but to review community guidelines and bylaws with an eye toward justice and readability. As odd as it may seem, the typo had nudged an entire nation toward greater empathy not through tragedy, but through text. It had reminded everyone that words matter, that precision isn't the enemy of passion, but its partner, that democracy doesn't have to be a battle. Sometimes it can be a beautifully edited draft passed around the table, each voice contributing a little more clarity. And so, as the movement settled into the rhythm of Canadian life, neither fizzling nor erupting, but simply continuing, there emerged a new kind of national pride. Not the loud, chest-thumping kind, but the quiet, contented pride of a country that had found a way to repair itself with kindness. A nation where the biggest scandal of the decade wasn't who shouted loudest, but who proofread best. And somewhere, perhaps in a modest government building in Regina, or a cozy reading room in Yellowknife, the original typo still sat, quietly immortalized in its original form, a humble error that had started something much larger, and far more beautiful than anyone could have expected. Somewhere in the middle of all this charming commotion, this national project of gentle correction and bureaucratic re-enchantment, people began to wonder where exactly the original typo had come from. It had appeared, innocuously enough, on page 12 of a budget appendix, in a paragraph so dull that even accountants had skimmed it on first read. Yet now it had grown mythic, like a sacred smudge on a medieval manuscript, or the accidental ink blot that turned into a revered saint's profile in some forgotten abbey's margins. The sentence in question, clunky, overlong, and missing one crucial knot, had inadvertently made a policy sound. like a mandatory requirement for citizens to agree with everything the government said. Of course, the policy itself was more about funding for community liaison offices than actual thought policing. But the phrasing, it was as if someone had typed it in a hurry, their fingers outrunning their better judgment. Or maybe they'd been distracted by a sandwich, or perhaps the office fluorescent lights had buzzed just wrong at that moment. Whatever the reason, that tiny missing knot had become the pebble in the nation's shoother, little irritant that had sparked a grand slow shuffle toward sanity. As journalists and scholars tried to trace the origins of the mistake, what they uncovered wasn't scandalous, but strangely poignant. The original document had passed through a dozen desks, each staffed by well-meaning professionals who had been too tired, too polite, or too trusting to question a sentence that didn't feel quite right. It was the bureaucratic version of watching someone mispronounce a name at a party and deciding, quietly, not to correct them for fear of causing embarrassment, or simply because it was easier to let it slide. But as Canadians revisited that moment through the lens of the rebellion, something peculiar happened. Instead of pointing fingers, they began to see themselves in the mistake. Everyone had, at one time or another, failed to speak up when something felt off. Everyone had nodded at meetings while silently wondering, wait, what did that just say? The typo became less a symbol of government incompetence and more a mirror reflecting the national temperament, earnest, collaborative, and perhaps a little too deferential for its own good. That reflection led to introspection, not just in government, but in everyday life. Workplaces began holding clarity audits, where employees were encouraged to gently rewrite confusing memos, poorly worded emails, or decades-old mission statements. Churches hosted potlucks themed around favorite misprints in hymn books or sacred texts, with congregants reading aloud their most delightful discoveries in tones of reverent amusement. A daycare in Saskatchewan created a typo tree where children could hang funny misspellings they spotted in picture books, each leaf a badge of growing linguistic vigilance. Even marriages weren't immune. A spate of local newspaper columns sprang up humorously recounting how couples were now revisiting their wedding vows, not to change their promises, but to revise the syntax. One popular post read, "After 10 years of loving commitment, I finally admitted that my vow to honor, obey, and mutually coordinate should have read communicate. But maybe it was right the first time." This tide of editorial enthusiasm eventually caught the attention of the Canadian Postal Service, which announced a limited run of commemorative stamps celebrating famous national typos. Among the designs were a postage stamp featuring the fabled budget page with the missing knot, a historical envelope with an early misspelling of Saskatchewan as Saskatchewan, and a playful depiction of a goose holding a red pen in its beak, poised to edit a letter addressed to Parliament. The stamp series sold out within days, collected not just by philatelists, but by schoolteachers, librarians, and grammar nerds with newfound national pride. And still, the movement pressed on not as a protest, but as a prolonged public proofreading party, where every Canadian, regardless of age or province, had a role to play. Retired teachers were in high demand. Coffee shops hosted comma clubs, where locals debated the merits of semicolons over muffins and maple lattes. Radio stations ran weekly syntax spotlights, correcting historic speeches while giggling softly at archaic turns of phrase. One host noted that reading 1970s federal documents aloud is like listening to someone try to recite poetry underwater. And no one disagreed. The Canadian Armed Forces, caught up in the national mood, revised its internal communications manual to include training modules on clarity and emotional tone. Military briefings became less barked and more reasoned. Even naval messages began incorporating please and thank you without losing precision. A young lieutenant told the CBC, "I used to say affirmative. Now I say, yes. That sounds perfectly reasonable." This quiet cultural shift didn't escape the eyes of the world. Norway sent a delegation of linguists to observe the rebellion. New Zealand, long considered a kindred nation in the realm of outdoorsy politeness, invited Canadian editors to co-author a Trans-Pacific Guide to Humane Governance language. Meanwhile, in the United States, some government agencies began casually asking their Canadian counterparts if they might share tips on calming the tone of internal memos. And somewhere, amid all the mild-mannered upheaval, the question emerged again. Who, exactly, had made the typo? The answer, when it came, was underwhelming in the best way possible. A junior clerk, no longer even working in government, stepped forward and confessed that they had likely been responsible. Their name was Miranda. She'd been 24 at the time, new to the department, and overwhelmed by deadlines and style guides. I knew the sentence was weird, she told an interviewer, but I didn't want to ask. I thought maybe I just didn't understand it, so I let it go. Rather than being vilified, Miranda became a national treasure. Her honesty, humility, and unintentional role in sparking the most adorably Canadian uprising in history made her a minor folk hero. A bronze plaque was quietly installed outside the office building where the document had been typed, bearing a quote from her interview. I thought it wasn't my place to fix it, but it turns out it was. Schoolchildren began reciting that line in assemblies. Universities offered scholarships in her name, and in a poetic turn no one could have predicted. Miranda, now a freelance editor, was hired to help draft a new citizen's guide to government communication, with a single rule printed on the cover. If it doesn't make sense, say something. In that moment, the typo had come full circle. What began as an accident, a blip in a dusty document, had become a parable, a lesson, and a national turning point. Not through force or fury, but through reflection and revision. Through the simple, brave act of noticing and caring enough to correct. If you lean back and imagine the quiet streets of a Canadian town in those years, you might picture a gentle scene. People gathering in cozy libraries and community halls. Their voices hushed but earnest as they debated commas and questioned clauses like knights of grammar wielding pens instead of swords. It was not a rebellion of shouts and barricades, but of careful conversation and shared smiles. Neighbors lent each other dictionaries and style guides. Someone brought homemade cookies shaped like apostrophes, and someone else arranged a display of the first printed books with charmingly inconsistent spelling that reminded everyone how human mistakes had always shaped history. Even the postal carriers played their part, slowing their routes to chat about how best to phrase a phrase, whether a semicolon or a dash might better serve the public spirit. The rebellion unfolded not in violent clashes, but in the slow turning of pages, the careful folding of letters, the subtle rephrasing of speeches that once seemed carved in stone, but now softened like winter snow melting into spring. And as this widespread re-examination continued, something unexpected blossomed, a renewed sense of connection to language, to one another, and to the idea that even the smallest details matter. People realized that words were not just tools for communication but vessels of care, kindness, and clarity. Schools started teaching the history of this gentle upheaval, framing it as a story of collective mindfulness, a national pause that reminded Canadians how to listen, not just with ears, but with hearts, and the legacy. It rippled outward. Poets found new inspiration in the tale of the typo that changed a country. Songs were written, softly sung in cafes and classrooms, telling of humble errors that sparked great understanding. Even architects cited the rebellion as a metaphor for designing spaces that invited reflection and dialogue. Spaces where the cracks in walls were not hidden but embraced, showing the beauty of imperfection and repair. In the end, the world watched, as a quiet country transformed its relationship with language, and, by extension, with itself. What had started as a simple typo grew into a symbol of resilience, humility, and the uniquely Canadian way of choosing kindness over confrontation. So, next time you stumble over a misplaced word, or hesitate before correcting a mistake, remember the polite rebellion where a single missing knot nudged a nation to rethink how it speaks, listens, and lives together. It's a reminder that sometimes even the smallest slips can start the softest revolutions, and that patience, empathy, and a little humor can be the strongest forces of all. Imagine for a moment the quiet streets and wooden porches of a small Canadian town during those long, soft evenings when the sky blushed pink and the first stars shyly appeared. There was no clamor of war drums or angry crowds, but rather a gentle ripple of whispers, murmurs, and polite debates spreading from kitchen tables to cozy libraries, from community halls to the local cafes warmed by the scent of fresh coffee and worn books. This was not a rebellion marked by violence or chaos, but by an unusual kind of revolution. One sparked by a simple mistake, one missing word that slipped unnoticed into 8 official documents and public speeches, and quietly unsettled the familiar order. It started as a curiosity, a little missing knot that changed the meaning of a law, a phrase, a promise. But that tiny error invited everyone to lean in closer, to listen more carefully, and to question how much power was hidden in the smallest details of language. Neighbors began lending each other dictionaries and grammar guides, sharing notes on the history of punctuation and spelling, laughing softly over old stories of past scribes and printers, whose own errors had accidentally shaped whole eras. The postman, making his daily rounds through the frosty streets, would pause a moment to exchange friendly words about commas and apostrophes, delivering not just letters, but a spirit of curiosity and connection. Families gathered around firesides, sipping tea, as elders recounted how this odd typo had sparked not anger or division, but something altogether more Canadian, a collective pause filled with reflection, humility, and the gentle humor of recognizing that nobody, no matter how important, was perfect. The rebellion grew not through shouts, but through pages turned slowly, ink smudged thoughtfully, as speeches and texts were carefully reread and rewritten to embrace clarity and kindness. It was as if the entire country had been invited to a quiet dance with language, stepping lightly to a rhythm that valued listening above all else. Schools began teaching this moment as a turning point, story not of conflict, but of connection, where Canadians learned that language was not a rigid set of rules to enforce, but a living tapestry to weave together with care and respect. Poets and songwriters took inspiration from this gentle upheaval, penning verses and melodies that captured the spirit of the polite rebellion. Songs that filled cafes and classrooms with a warm glow of shared history and hope. Architects spoke of it too, likening the careful patching and repairing of words to the way they designed buildings that welcomed conversation, with cracks left visible as a testament to resilience and openness rather than shame or weakness. And as the years passed, what began as a tiny typo blossomed into a symbol of a nation's values, patience, empathy, and a deep commitment to kindness over conflict. This quiet revolution reminded everyone that sometimes the softest changes are the most powerful, that a simple act of noticing and correcting can ripple outward to change the way people see themselves and one another. So, whenever you hesitate before correcting a small mistake, or find yourself smiling at a misstep in speech or writing, remember that somewhere in history, a missing word helped a whole country rediscover the beauty of listening, the strength of humility, and the warmth of human connection. It's a story that whispers to us all, encouraging us to embrace imperfection, to laugh a little more kindly, and to know that sometimes the smallest slips can start the gentlest revolution that last far longer than any shout or battle cry ever could. Picture, if you will, the dimming light of a late autumn afternoon in a small Canadian town, where the fading amber glow seeps slowly beneath cracked wooden shutters and settles softly over frost-kissed streets. There is no blare of trumpets, no marching feet echoing off stone walls, only the whisper of wind weaving its way through leafless trees and the muffled footsteps of townsfolk wrapped in layers of thick wool and quiet resolve. This, you see, is where a very unusual kind of rebellion began, not with swords or shouts, but with something far more subtle, a simple typo, a single missing word, that crept into the formal scripts of law and speech, and without fanfare, unsettled the foundations of how people understood their rights and responsibilities. It was a missing knot, a small absence that changed a sentence's meaning entirely, like a misplaced note in a familiar melody, causing confusion, curiosity, and a cascade of reflection among the people who encountered it. At first, the mistake went unnoticed by many, swallowed by the slow churn of bureaucracy. But for those who read between the lines, those with sharp eyes and sharper minds, sparked a quiet questioning. How could such a tiny slip hold so much power? How could the omission of one word shift the balance of justice, the tone of governance, the very meaning of a promise? In this slow-burning moment of awareness, neighbors began to gather in parlors and libraries, pulling dusty tomes from shelves, poring over language with the care of scholars and the wonder of children discovering a secret. the local postmaster, an unassuming man who carried the day's news across town, found himself paused at doorsteps, not just to deliver letters, but to discuss the weight of commas and the grace of semicolons, of hyphens and dashes, and the curious dance they performed in shaping thought. At kitchen tables, families sat close, their breath mingling in the cold air. Hands wrapped around steaming cups, as conversations meandered from recipes to rhetoric, from village gossip to grammar guides passed down like heirlooms. The typo, rather than igniting anger, nurtured a collective humility, a gentle reminder that even the most carefully crafted words were fragile, fallible, human. It invited patience and kindness, an embrace of imperfection as part of the shared human experience. Schools took up the story, teaching it not as a failure, but as a turning point. A tale of attentive listening and the power of small details to ripple through a community and reshape understanding. Poets, moved by this soft upheaval, wove verses about misplaced words and the beauty of gentle correction. Their stanzas whispered in cafes filled with the scent of rain and fresh parchment, sung softly during evening gatherings where stories grew like wildflowers in the fertile soil of shared memory. Architects spoke of the rebellion too, seeing in its quiet persistence a metaphor for their own craft, how buildings could welcome flaws and fractures, turning cracks into invitations for light and air, celebrating resilience over perfection. As the years unfolded, the missing knot became more than a mere typo. It became a symbol of the uniquely Canadian spirit, patient, thoughtful, and endlessly polite even in moments of disruption. It taught a nation that language was a living thing, not rigid law but delicate dance, and that sometimes the softest revolutions are those that start with a single, unexpected slip. So next time you stumble over a misplaced word, hesitate before correcting a friend, or smile at a small mistake, remember this tale of quiet rebellion. It reminds us that kindness and humility can transform confusion into connection, that imperfection can be a bridge rather than a barrier, and that sometimes the gentlest of errors can ignite the most lasting change softly, patiently, and with an undeniable grace that lingers long after the last page is turned. Beneath the pale light of a waning moon, in a village where shadows stretched long and quiet over cobblestone lanes and thatched rooftops, the whispers of a most peculiar kind of rebellion carried softly on the chill night air, twisting through the alleyways like a secret melody that only the keenest ears could catch. This was not the roar of swords clashing or the thunder of hooves charging across open fields, but a far subtler resistance, woven delicately through the fabric of language itself. Single missing word, a small absence that rippled outward, with the grace of a stone dropped into a still pond. It began, as these things often do, in the margins of dusty ledgers and faded letters, where a simple typo, forgotten not, altered decrees, twisted commands, and quietly questioned the authority that once seemed so unyielding. Imagine the impact. A sentence that once forbade an action now read as permission. A rule that once protected now opened doors, all because of one small slip of the pen. Those who noticed did not rush to outrage, but rather leaned in, curious and careful, as if trying to read the faintest whispers of a forgotten song. Families huddled around fireplaces, the flickering flames casting long shadows that danced along worn wooden beams, while elders recounted tales of times when words were wielded like weapons, yet also as keys to unlock new paths. Children listened, wide-eyed, their imaginations sparked by the idea that a single missing word could stir a revolution of manners and minds. Across the village, scholars pored over texts, tracing the journey of this tiny omission through ink-stained pages, uncovering layers of meaning that had gone unnoticed for generations. Their discussions filled quiet study rooms with a buzz of excitement and gentle debate, as they explored how such a minute error could expose the fragility of human constructs, laws, promises, social contracts, and invite a more nuanced understanding of authority and consent. The postmaster became an unlikely messenger, not only of letters, but of ideas, stopping to share discoveries with neighbors at doorsteps, his voice low and earnest as he spoke of the power tucked within the spaces between words. Even the local cobbler, whose hands shaped sturdy boots to withstand the cold, found himself reflecting on how the world could shift on the edge of a letter's absence. a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes begin not with force, but with reflection and kindness. As the nights grew colder, and the village settled deeper into the rhythm of winter, the community's relationship with language transformed, embracing imperfection as a shared human trait, rather than a failing to be punished. The missing knot became a symbol of humility and patience, encouraging people to listen more closely and speak more gently, to seek understanding rather than confrontation. Storytellers carried this quiet rebellion into songs and poems, weaving it into the cultural fabric, so that future generations would remember that even mistakes can hold meaning, and that grace often lives in the spaces we overlook. This gentle upheaval spread beyond the village borders, inspiring artists and thinkers in distant towns to reconsider how words shape reality and how kindness can be the softest form of resistance. It reminded everyone that history is not only made by grand battles and bold declarations, but also by the small, tender moments where people choose empathy over anger, curiosity over judgment. So when you next find yourself hesitating before correcting a slip, or pausing to appreciate the imperfect beauty of a spoken word, recall this story of a rebellion born from a typo, a rebellion that teaches us that sometimes the quietest voices can spark the most enduring change, carried not by the clash of arms, but by the gentle rhythm of understanding and the patient dance of words. In the muted dawn light filtering through frost-covered windows, the village awoke to a world that felt subtly altered, as if the air itself held a new kind of quiet promise, a gentle undercurrent of change born on whispered conversations and shared glances. The small typo that had quietly slipped into official documents was no longer merely a clerical error, but had taken on the weight of legenda, catalyst that reshaped relationships and power with the softest of touches. Elders gathered beneath the ancient oak in the village square, their breath visible in the crisp morning air, recounting how that missing knot had shifted the tone of laws from rigid commands to tentative invitations, from punishments to possibilities. They spoke in measured tones about how it had invited questions rather than silenced them, fostering a spirit of polite dissent that spread like the delicate tendrils of mist over the surrounding fields. Merchants who once approached their stalls with wary eyes now exchanged nods and quiet smiles, sensing the subtle easing of tension that accompanied this newfound space for gentle negotiation. The baker's daughter, kneading dough with steady hands, hummed an old tune that had been rewritten to include verses about patience and understanding, a melodic echo of the village's slow awakening to a more compassionate way of being. Throughout the day, conversations blossomed like fragile wildflowers in the cracks of everyday routine, weaving through the marketplace and into humble homes where families gathered to share simple meals and stories that blended fact and fable in equal measure. In the flicker of candlelight, whispers of the polite rebellion grew into a narrative that celebrated kindness as a quiet form of strength, a reminder that change need not be loud or violent to be profound. The blacksmith paused his hammering to reflect on how this gentle upheaval had softened the edges of authority, turning commands into conversations and rules into shared understandings. Children played in the streets with an unusual lightness in their step, as if buoyed by the invisible threads of hope that connected them to generations past and future alike. Even the village dogs seemed to sense the shift, their barks less sharp, their tails wagging with a newfound calm. As twilight deepened, the village settled into a peaceful hush, the stars overhead shimmering with quiet approval, as if bearing witness to a world where a simple mistake had sparked a revolution of manners and hearts. This was a rebellion not fought with swords or siege engines, but with the soft power of empathy, the enduring magic of a single word left unsaid, reminding us all that sometimes the most lasting change begins not with fury, but with the gentle courage to listen, to forgive, and to imagine a kinder way forward. Beneath the silver glow of a crescent moon, the village's streets lay silent, cloaked in frost that shimmered like crushed diamonds under the faint starlight. It was in these quiet hours, when the world seemed to hold its breath, that the true impact of the missing knot was felt most keenly, not in grand proclamations, but in the small, intimate moments that stitched the community together like fragile threads in a delicate tapestry. In humble homes where firelight flickered softly against worn timber walls, families gathered closer, their voices lowered to a soothing murmur as they shared tales of days past and hopes for days to come. The absence of that single word had done more than alter legal texts. It had softened the very fabric of human interaction, inviting a reconsideration of what it meant to live in harmony despite difference and disagreement. Elderly women, their hands weathered from years of toil, passed down whispered advice to grandchildren, teaching them that sometimes it is in silence and in the spaces between words where true understanding grows. Meanwhile, the village scribe, once burdened by the weight of exactitude and the fear of error, found freedom in imperfection, realizing that language is a living, breathing thing, ever evolving and forgiving. In the marketplace, bartering took on a new rhythm, less rigid, more fluid. As merchants smiled behind counters piled high with autumn apples and hand-woven cloth, trading not just goods, but stories and laughter. The smithy's hammer rang out, less as a call to arms, and more as a steady heartbeat, a reminder of the village's resilience and its embrace of quiet change. Even the oldest church bell, perched high in its weathered tower, tolled with a gentler tone, echoing through the valley like a soft invitation to reflection and renewal. Outside, the frozen river sparkled under the night sky, its icy surface mirroring the stars as if the heavens themselves conspired to bless this peculiar rebellion born of omission and grace. This was not a rebellion marked by upheaval or fury, but by the gentle revolution of manners and minds, a subtle shift toward kindness that whispered through every hearth and home. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin not with thunderous cries, but with the quiet courage to embrace flaw, to find beauty in the incomplete, and to choose empathy when correction might have led only to division. So as the village drifted into sleep, wrapped in the soft embrace of winter's hush, the story of the typo that started the world's most polite rebellion lingered in the air, a testament to the enduring strength of gentleness, the humble magic of human error, and the hope that even the smallest change can illuminate the darkest night. In the first light of dawn, when frost still clung like delicate lace to the edges of wooden shutters, and the faint aroma of smoldering peat drifted through the crisp air, the village stirred with a sense of cautious optimism. The memory of the typo, once a mere curiosity buried in the dusty archives of the Lord's records, had become a quiet legend, a gentle ripple that spread through every lane and hearth. As smoke curled lazily from chimneys, villagers stepped out into the muted glow, their breath forming soft clouds that mingled with the rising mist over fields dusted with snow. The old baker, with flour-dusted hands and a twinkle in his eye, recalled how the change had subtly shifted his daily exchanges, not with anger or demands, but with courteous requests and the occasional knowing smile. Across the way, the blacksmith's apprentice paused by the forge, the heat warming his fingers as he contemplated how respect had begun to replace suspicion in dealings once fraught with tension. In the modest schoolhouse, where children huddled around a flickering candle, lessons now included stories of this accidental revolution, teaching young minds that even mistakes could sow seeds of kindness and understanding. The village inn buzzed, quietly, with conversations that mingled gratitude with surprise, as neighbors discussed how the old ways of command and control had given way to negotiation and shared responsibility. Through narrow alleyways lined with frost-kissed cobblestones, the soft murmur of voices carried tales of neighbors helping neighbors, of disputes settled with patience rather than sharp words, and of a community bound not by fear but by mutual respect. Even the local priest, whose sermons once echoed with stern warnings, now spoke gently of grace and humility, weaving the story of the polite rebellion into sermons that touched hearts and softened minds. Outside the village, the landscape stretched, wide and still, fields lying fallow beneath a blanket of white. The silence broken only by the occasional caw of a distant crow or the crunch of footsteps on frozen ground. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging that here, in this small corner of history, something remarkable had taken root, not a grand upheaval, but a quiet transformation born from a simple, overlooked error. And as the day unfolded, weaving light through bare branches and casting long shadows across the frozen earth, the village moved forward with a newfound grace, carrying in its collective heart the gentle lesson that even the smallest change, even a single missing word, can rewrite the story of how people live together, not with fury or force, but with the enduring power of polite rebellion. Morning light spilled through the frost-covered panes, casting delicate patterns on the rough-hewn tables where village folk gathered to share their modest breakfasts, bowls of thin porridge, steaming softly. The scent mingling with the faint earthiness of dried herbs hung near the hearth. Outside, the air held a crisp stillness, a quiet pause before the daily bustle. Yet beneath that calm simmered a subtle energy, born not of swords or banners, but of a shared understanding that the world could be shaped differently. The typo, a mere slip of ink in an official scroll, had unknowingly loosened the rigid chains of authority, replacing them with an unexpected dance of courtesy and gentle negotiation that rippled through the fabric of everyday life. Farmers who once grudgingly handed over their harvest now exchanged goods with a smile. Their words softened, laced with unexpected kindness. Market vendors greeted patrons with sincere warmth rather than curt nods, and even disputes between neighbors found resolution not in bitter arguments but in patient listening and thoughtful compromise. At the center of the village, the old oak tree, gnarled and ancient, its bare branches scratching the pale sky, stood witness to whispered conversations and secret meetings where plans for peaceful change took shape, fueled by hope and tempered by restraint. Children, wrapped in patchwork cloaks, played beneath its skeletal limbs, their laughter a fragile melody against the backdrop of winter's hush. The village elders, gathered around the fire's glow in dimly lit cottages, exchanged stories that wove history and legend together, each recounting how this simple error had blossomed into a quiet revolution of civility. In the weaving of wool and the shaping of clay, in the rhythm of daily toil, the spirit of polite rebellion thrived, invisible yet unmistakable. Even the natural world seemed to join in. Birdsong carried a gentler tune, the river's flow whispered of renewal, and the pale sun, low on the horizon, cast long shadows that spoke of endurance and change. This was a rebellion not of noise and chaos but of subtle shifts, where patience replaced impatience, and understanding quietly triumphed over harshness. As the day stretched onward, village life moved with a rhythm both familiar and transformed. Ordinary tasks, now tinged with an extraordinary grace born from a single missing word, a forgotten mistake, and the remarkable humanity, thaw. Before the sun fully crested the horizon, the village lay swathed in a fragile veil of frost, the air so cold it seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself were waiting to witness what would unfold from a simple mistake, centuries old. The dawn was silent but heavy with promise. Each curled tendril of smoke rising from crooked chimneys told stories of survival and quiet hope. The fragile hearth fires flickering in humble homes like tiny beacons against the relentless grip of winter. It was here, amidst the uneven cobblestones dusted with snow, and the skeletal remains of last season's crops poking through the frozen earth, that a strange change was blossoming, seeded not by grand speeches or bloody uprisings, but by a mere slip, a typo, that altered a command, and in doing so, transformed the very nature of rebellion itself. The village, once tightly bound by fear of harsh lordly decrees and enforced punishments, found itself awakening to a gentler kind of resistance, one woven through softened words, polite refusals, and the subtle art of refusing without raising fists or voices. Conversations once filled with resentment and quiet desperation now bore a curious warmth. Neighbors greeting each other not with wary glances, but with cautious smiles, their interactions marked by a new rhythm of respect and unexpected civility. The blacksmith's hammer rang out over the frosty air, steady and sure, while inside his dim workshop, beneath layers of soot and sweat, a newfound patience settled into the hearts of men and women who once bristled at authority's heavy hand. At the market, the murmur of bargaining carried less bitterness. Even the youngest children seemed to sense the shift, playing among the stalls with a brightness in their eyes that reflected an unspoken hope. The typo, a missing word in a ledger, a mistaken phrase in an official proclamation, had been forgotten by many, buried under years of dust and silence, but its effects were impossible to ignore. It was as if the cold, which had once seemed to seep into every bone and crack of the village's fragile homes, had thawed something deep within the community's spirit, urging them to find strength not in violence or rebellion, but in politeness and perseverance. Behind the crooked walls of wattle and daub cottages, where smoke curled thick and the scent of burning wood mingled with damp earth, families gathered closer than ever before. They shared stories and songs by the flickering hearths, their voices low and steady, weaving a tapestry of connection that wove together old traditions with this emerging new way of being. Elders, once stern and unyielding, softened their gaze, as they recounted tales not of conquest and punishment, but of resilience born from kindness. The village priest, standing beneath the faded frescoes of a tiny stone chapel, preached not only of divine justice, but of mercy, urging his flock to embrace the power of gentle resistance. Even the animals, those faithful companions of village life, seemed to sense the change. Cows huddled and shared warmth, their soft lowing a steady comfort in the biting cold, while goats and chickens moved with a calmness that reflected the growing peace between human hearts. Outside, the frozen fields stretched silent and white, but beneath the snow lay the roots of a quiet revolution, a movement fueled by the simple but radical act of choosing to be courteous in a world that expected submission or rage. Villagers learned to navigate this new terrain, with care no longer meeting authority with defiance, but with a calm firmness that confused and disarmed, like a soft breeze scattering the sharpest thorns. Meetings once held in secret now spilled into the open air. Conversations carried on porches and in the village square beneath the watchful gaze of frost-tipped branches. Agreements were reached over shared mugs of weak ale, and disputes settled with handshakes that bore the weight of mutual respect rather than grudging tolerance. Children listened wide-eyed as their parents explained how a single missing word had softened the harsh commands into gentle requests, how a tiny oversight in a document had opened the door for dialogue instead of conflict. They learned that rebellion did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, and that whispers could be just as powerful. This polite rebellion grew not from grand battles or bloodshed, but from thousands of small acts of kindness and understanding that together created a new way of living, a patchwork of civility stitched through everyday life. As the village prepared for the long winter days ahead, with frozen breaths mingling in the cold air and fire sputtering in stone hearths, the people found warmth not only in flame, but in the shared knowledge that change, however small and unexpected, was possible. The typo, once a forgotten error, had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the smallest slip could shift the course of history, that even in the darkest cold, a light could shine through the cracks. And so, wrapped in layers of wool and patience, surrounded by the quiet hum of community and the soft crackle of burning wood, the village faced the biting winter with a newfound grace, its people bound not by fear or force, but by the gentle power of polite rebellion. In the waning light of a cold, quiet evening, when the last embers of the hearth flickered low, and the village settled into a fragile hush beneath a sky full of distant stars, the story of that small but profound typo echoed like a gentle whisper. Through the ages, a delicate reminder that history is not only shaped by great armies or sweeping speeches, but sometimes by the faintest slip of the pen and the softest acts of human kindness. The polite rebellion it sparked continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have foreseen, transforming ordinary people's lives not through violence or anger, but through resilience, grace, and the quiet strength of respect. In homes where the smoke curled in lazy spirals and the chill of winter nipped at cracked wooden doors, families huddled closer, warmed by more than just fire. They shared stories spun with laughter and tears, woven from the fabric of their shared humanity, and the strange, wonderful idea that sometimes changing the world meant simply choosing gentleness over fury. The village, once shadowed by fear and harsh decree, blossomed into a place where disagreement did not have to end in conflict, where words could be soft shields and kindness a rallying cry. Children grew up hearing tales not just of battlefields, but of boardrooms of the past where a single misplaced letter had carved space for civility, teaching them that rebellion could be polite, persistence patient, and strength found in understanding rather than destruction. Even the cold seemed to relent slightly, as if moved by the warmth spreading in hearts and hearths alike, wrapping the world in a soft blanket woven from hope and quiet courage. Travelers passing through noticed a gentleness in the villagers, smiles and the careful way neighbors helped one another, as if every act of politeness was a brick laid in a new foundation of peace. And while the old lords and rulers might have scoffed or scorned this strange uprising, the people knew something they could never take away: the power to rewrite the rules. to shape history with kindness and wit, and to survive even the harshest winters, not just by enduring the cold, but by warming each other's souls. So as the night deepened and dreams took hold beneath quilts patched with time and memory, the story of the typo and the world's most polite rebellion settled into legend, a soft murmur in the tapestry of time, inviting us all to remember that sometimes the smallest mistake can spark the greatest change. That change, when it comes wrapped in respect and humanity, has a power that lasts far beyond any battle cry. In this quiet, lingering moment, the world seemed a little gentler, the shadows a little softer, and the future a promise, whispered on the coldest of nights, a testament to the enduring strength of politeness, born from a